Good morning.
Morning. Morning.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Wait a minute.
Today, the first Sunday of Advent, is a traditional start of the church year, not the calendar year, as you probably figured out already. For some reason, the church year starts in the first Sunday of Advent. And insofar as we use the lectionary in this church, this is the year of the Gospel of Mark. So I thought I would spend just a couple of minutes introducing you to the Gospel of Mark this year, or today, so that you sort of get a feeling for what's coming up. Tradition says that Mark was the second Gospel written, that Matthew wrote his Gospel first, and that Mark came along and shortened it a bit, made it a little simpler, left out some bits. This is probably not actually correct. Scholars tend to believe that Mark, in fact, was the first Gospel written, and that Matthew and probably Luke had copies of Mark in front of them, not the person but the book, in front of them as they were writing their Gospels. So Mark is probably the earliest record we have of the stories of Jesus. Mark is also the shortest of the Gospels. So there's lots of stuff we're going to have to supplement Mark regularly throughout the year with other Gospels for things we sort of expect to see. One of the most obvious cases of that is right now, where we're using Mark chapter 13 this Sunday. But after this, we're not going to be able to use Mark for the Christmas story because it's not there. There's no Christmas story in Mark, so we sort of have to go to Luke and Matthew for those things. The earliest tradition we have about the Gospel of Mark comes to us from the early church historian. His name was Eusebius, who wrote in the 4th century. And Eusebius said that, Papias said that the presbyter used to say that Mark, in fact, was Peter's interpreter. So as Peter the fisherman was wandering around, here and there, preaching and proclaiming the gospel, he was fine as long as things were going on in Aramaic, but the moment they switched to Greek or Latin or something else, he needed an interpreter. So that was Mark's job. And Peter, he didn't just tell the story of Jesus the same way every time. He told it differently depending on who he was talking to. Right? Because any good speaker looks at the audience and goes, here are the needs of the audience. Here's the way I'm going to tell my story about Jesus so that it makes sense, so that it fits with what's going on, so that it communicates with this audience. So Mark has all of these stories about Jesus in his head that he's heard from Peter, but he's often heard the same story in different ways. So presumably after Peter dies, Mark sits down and goes, wow, I should really write this all down so that the next generation can also hear these stories. So Mark writes down what he remembers of Peter's stories, and the best he can remember them, but he doesn't actually know what order they happened in. So the book of Mark is, according to Eusebius, according to Papias, according to the presbyter, not in the correct order, except that Jesus probably dies somewhere near the end of his life. Right? And resurrection follows that. But otherwise, Mark is, we don't know if the order is correct. So what this sort of means is that Mark is really the mysterious gospel. It's really tough to figure out exactly what Mark is doing. That there's times that you read Mark and you study Mark and you go, wow, that's just brilliant. Look at the way he arranges his story. So he's got this cool way of breaking stories in half. And he tells you half of the story, and then he inserts something, and then he tells you the second half of the story. Right? And there's always something about that middle bit that tells you something about the wider thing that's going on. So there's parts of it that are just really cool, like he's really paying attention. And other parts of Mark where you're going, what was he doing? What was he thinking? Some of his Greek is just rough. It's like, no, you can say that a lot of what Matthew does is fix Mark's Greek, because it's not really very good. Right? So it's just hard to figure out sometimes what Mark is trying to do. Which is probably the reason that Mark is my favorite gospel. I like mystery. I don't really feel the need to solve for X all of the time. A lot of times it's sort of nice, when you You want your car to start in the morning, and if it doesn't, you want to be able to solve, and fix that. But there's parts of this world that don't need to be explained as far as I'm concerned. And there's lots and lots and lots about Jesus we will never figure out no matter how good Mark is. So we have Mark, this mysterious gospel. The other thing about this morning is that the first Sunday of Advent, for some reason, is always apocalyptic. It's always about the end of the world. And that's always, again, seemed to me a bit of a puzzling way to start the year. You start the year, you start this looking forward to the coming of Jesus with this end of the world kind of stuff going on, which in some ways feels a bit curious, but in some ways it also works really well. Because we need to start the year by reminding ourselves, and especially at Christmas, especially at Advent, to remind ourselves that this isn't just about some little baby that was born 2,000 years ago and, oh, look, aren't the sheep cute? Right? This is all about something that is happening and will continue to happen, and there's a purpose to all of this. There's a plan to all of this. It's not like God said, oh, I'm going to send a cute baby, everyone's going to be happy and live happily ever after, it's going to be cool. Right? It's like God said, well, here's a step. Let me try this. Right? And then the world continues. And then God says, well, let me try this. And let me try this. And today, too, God is hopefully, right? I mean, our faith is that God continues to have a desire for this world and a plan for this world and a goal, however much of a mess things seem to be. And part of it is also that, yes, things seem to be a mess, and it's hard a lot of times to maintain that belief, to maintain that hope. And so we start the year there. We start the year by saying yes to that hope, to yes to that faith, that there is something larger going on here, not because we can see it, but often because we can't. Because no matter how hard we look around, we go, wow, this is just not getting better. But our faith says, God still has a plan here. Something is moving forward. I was going to say this morning that one of the problems with apocalyptic is that we don't understand it well. Because apocalyptic is written for people in distress, in despair, for whom the future looks really bleak. But that's starting to feel a lot like home, isn't it? Right? That we live in a nation in distress and in despair, for whom, I think for a lot of us, the future looks pretty bleak. So I think maybe it's even easier to understand apocalyptic now than it was a few years ago. Again, there are people in Morgantown for whom they think things are just constantly getting better, and they're just really, really happy now. So, again, I can't say we all think the same way or feel the same way about this, but I know, certainly there are days when I try to maintain hope, and it's hard. However you feel about the future and the reality today, it's often also helpful to think about the world from somebody else's perspective. So insofar as it's even remotely possible, I want to just temporarily transport us, I suppose, to the country of Yemen. Never been there, but it's not very hard to imagine. It's hot, it's dry, it's dusty. There's sand blowing everywhere all of the time. We saw enough of this in Ghana that we understand, and there it was hot and wet and dusty, but it was still dusty. So dusty, right? So there's dust covers everything, and it's just hotter than you want to imagine, and it's going to get hotter as the day goes along. And currently in Yemen, our country is dropping bombs. And other countries are dropping bombs, and Group A is dropping bombs on Group B, who's dropping bombs back. And this means nothing to most people except that their access to food is basically gone. And there are millions of people in Yemen today in danger of starvation. And there are millions of people in Yemen today who aren't sure if a bomb is going to drop on their head today or not. Just right, get your head out of Morgantown and into Yemen for a minute and listen to Mark. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Apocalyptic still has something to say to our world. This year, our theme that we're going to be walking with through Advent is Let It Be. Which is, again, a really tricky theme for many of us. Because Let It Be is about letting it be. And we're not mostly a Let It Be group. We're mostly a go out and fix it sort of people. We've got people who can fix just about anything here that you need fixing. And if they can't do it with their hands, they can certainly do it in the abstract. Right? We can fix bodies, and we can fix just about anything in this group. And we're trying to fix so many other things that are stubbornly being broken, like governments and economic systems and just all of this stuff. And yet, our Advent sermons are going to be about Let It Be, which does not mean abandon the struggle, but it means there is a point of having some faith, and that's hard. In a lot of ways, having faith is harder than trying to fix things. Because, right, this idea of, well, there's something broken, we should fix it. Let It Be says we need to have trust. The apocalyptic tends to be passive, which is not what I'm calling us to. Which is not what the Scripture calls us to. Right? But we talk about faith a lot because this is a church. And so much of faith is trust. Is trust in a God who cares. Yes, that's hard. Because Jesus didn't say, I was hungry and you had another prayer meeting. I was thirsty and, you called another council and you had a committee. Right? So there's a lot of call to get out there and do stuff. But there's also this call to let it be. So that's my challenge for you this week. I know this is going to be hard. 5 times a day this week, not going to do prayer, wouldn't be a bad idea. 5 times a day, I want you to stop and take a deep breath. Say to yourself, let it be. See how that feels. And maybe you're going to plunge right back into doing what you were doing before. Maybe what you were doing before was necessary and had to get done anyway. But I think it's worth just letting it go for just a second, for just a minute. And then, with all of the faith you can muster, plunge yourself back into the work in front of you. 5 times a day, all week. See how it goes. Let It Be also calls us back to the basics. We're going to do the basics. So for us as a church, the basics are bread and wine. So I invite you to bring along your green books, in case if you don't know the song we're going to be singing next. And come forward and join me for communion.